Foundation in-depth member webinar. We will be starting in about a minute. Thank you for joining us. And we'll go through some housekeeping and going ahead and get started with our distinguished panelists today. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from around the world for today's Hyperledger Foundation in-depth member webinar. Today's discussion is going to be a lively one and very interesting, as we are all citizens of different jurisdictions, whether it's in the US or globally. We'll be talking about how states like the state of Rhode Island are driving process transformation in public services using blockchain, and working with partners like Infosys, one of our Hyperledger Foundation members, as well as AWS. So we're looking forward to this discussion today, and I'll introduce the panelists in a bit. Before we get started today, just a quick reminder that all are welcomed in the Hyperledger community. We are committed to creating a very safe and welcoming community for all. And if you have any questions, please visit our Hyperledger Code of Conduct. And all I ask is that you be nice to one another in the chat. We do want to encourage discussions as required, and but please be nice to one another and respectful. A couple other housekeeping items for today. You are joining a Hyperledger Foundation webinar. We do all our meetings are under our Linux Foundation antitrust policy. So if you have any questions about that, please read the full policy on our website. Today's session, in addition to being live streaming, and hello to the YouTube as well as the LinkedIn live webinar folks, it is being recorded, and the sessions will be available on our hyperledger.org website after the webinar concludes. You can also, today we don't have any slides, but for future or past webinars, you can always also download the slides available. This webinar is for you to learn from our panelists, but also to be able to get your questions answered. So there's a couple of ways that you can participate. You can raise your hand, and if we have time at the end, we can ask people to speak their questions. You can certainly, and we encourage you to go ahead and ask questions via the Q&A button. For those of you new to Zoom, there's a little button that says Q&A. Click on that button, ask your question, and either one of the panelists or others that are monitoring the Q&A folder we'll answer those questions, or we'll answer them live. And of course, chat. And let's go ahead and start, everyone. Let me know, where are you from? Put it in the chat. I'm calling in today, or I'm on this webinar from San Francisco. It's nice to see everybody. And hopefully we have people from around the world. I'm always delighted to see where people are dialing in from. So once again, welcome everybody, and let's go ahead and get started. Today's webinar is driving process transformation in public services using blockchain. We are all digital citizens, and I think how blockchain and related technologies are being used to improve citizen services is really a core service that I think many of us as citizens are interested in. Today, I'm honored to have on our panel Liz Tanner, the Honorable Liz Tanner, who was Secretary of Commerce at the State of Rhode Island, one of the small but very mighty states in the United States. And Liz has been a champion of the Hyperledger Foundation for many years, speaking at multiple events and really championing blockchain throughout the world. We also have Sri Challa, who's the Senior Director for Blockchain at Infosys. Sri has also been another longtime contributor to the Hyperledger Foundation and really driving transformation with their customers worldwide in using blockchain in various use cases. So we're interested and very excited about hearing his perspective on public services as well. And last but not least, we're pleased to welcome Charles Okachu. And Charles is a Senior Business Development Manager for AWS, and AWS has been working in partnership with Infosys and Rhode Island on some of these public services. So once again, welcome everyone in the audience, and especially welcome to the member panelists. Liz, it's always great to see you. So let's go ahead and get started. Maybe you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing there in Rhode Island.
Thank you so much, Daniela. Thanks for having me. Good to see you again, and good to see all the panelists. Some of them I haven't met before. I am currently the Secretary of Commerce for the State of Rhode Island, but I got into this space because I was an attorney who had many clients who were very frustrated with how hard it was to do government business for their business in the state, and they were looking for a way to make it easier. And so I came to state government and left private practice to try to make it easier to do business, and that's what led me down this path.
Excellent. Well, and we're very glad it did. So welcome. Sri?
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining from. I'm joining from Boston. I run the blockchain market initiatives for Infosys. My area of focus and my advent into this space has been from 2017. We've been involved in a number of initiatives on blockchain, especially for enterprise applications of blockchain. And believe it or not, one of the early sectors that we started working on was public sector, which continues to be the case. I'm glad to be joined here and share the stage with Liz Danner, who's my close friend and collaborator on a number of things that we've been working on. So excited to be part of this panel.
Awesome. Welcome, Sri. And Charles.
Hi, everybody. My name is Charles Okochu, and thank you all for joining this panel. I'm the Senior Business Development Manager for Amazon Managed Blockchain Service at AWS. I've been with AWS now for about 4 years, and my main role is helping to develop go-to-market strategies and business development initiatives for the blockchain service. And I work very closely with AWS customers like State of Rhode Island, sales teams, and partners like Infosys and Siri to deeply understand customer needs, identify the gaps, and look for opportunities for blockchain use cases across a broad spectrum of AWS customers globally. And that includes enterprises, startups, digital native businesses, ISVs, and also government and public sector customers. And prior to AWS, I worked in various leadership roles. My previous job was at a cryptocurrency hedge fund, as well as in fintech and banking firms across in Wall Street in New York. I worked on various projects on digital transformation and cloud migration and building high frequency trading platforms. So happy to be here and looking forward to interesting discussion.
Excellent. Well, once again, welcome to all. I think this is a great combination of a panel to really talk about the reality of how blockchain and public services, there is no doubt, and it's not just myself or my family and the people in my neighborhood that, citizens more and more worldwide, and especially in developed countries like in the United States, are demanding digital services. And, I would even venture to say that if public sector services are not thinking digital, they're going to lose their connections with citizens and the services that you need to provide the citizens. So was hoping that we could start maybe with a baseline of what public sector services citizens experience today, and highlighting maybe some of the key challenges and issues that we see, and that blockchain and blockchain related technologies could really enable. Liz, you're certainly, of all of us in the front lines here in the United States, in the state of Rhode Island. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing and kind of some of the challenges and issues, but also, what do you have to deliver to your citizens in order to meet their needs?
I mean, the answer is it's all over the place, right? It really just depends where you live specifically and what it is you're trying to do. A great example is I had one of my employees said, "Hey, I'm going to be in late about an hour tomorrow. I need to do something." Okay, fine. She came in and said, we're putting a new garage on top of, or new roof on top of our garage. So I needed to go to town hall to get a permit to make that happen. And when she got there, she went to go fill out a form and they said, "Well, actually, you have the ability to do this online." And that was a project that we had led within the state, but it really depends on what town you live in, right? Because not every town has it. So you've got a situation where you as a resident have no idea what to do. You have to kind of guess, because it might be fully electronic with where you can submit a credit card and do a transaction. It might be a PDF form where you can maybe fill it out online, or maybe you just have to print it and then fill it out and either send it in or mail it in, or maybe you can submit it electronically, or it might just be regular old. You have to physically drive somewhere, go to an office, handwrite a form, handwrite a check, whatever it might be. And so it's really just all over the place, and it causes confusion. And for our business clients, that's one of the chief complaints is, how am I supposed to know? How am I supposed to know what I'm supposed to do? I have to come and ask you to figure out what that means. So that means time, that means convenience. And it can be a real burden if you're trying to run business or trying to go to work for the day, and now you have to call and work late. So, for what we see, it's all over the place. Now, if you do have technology, great, wonderful. But a lot of these technologies are older, so you might have some where they have a PDF, and that was the new hot technology a long time ago, but it's not anymore. And so you're trying to convert out of something that they're already paying for to something new. And is it more expensive, less expensive? It's always more expensive, right? There's never anything that's less expensive. But does that technology that you have, does it have an API? Can you make some sort of a connection? So the answer, I would imagine, in any government and any jurisdiction across the globe, is it really just depends. You have to figure it out, and it can be very burdensome for any kind of a person or a business to do business with the government.
Mm-hmm. The core is digital transformation, and certainly, many cities and states and nations worldwide are at different stages of that transformation, and being able to offer those citizen services. Sri, what is Infosys? I know you work with a lot of customers in the space as well, the public sector space. What are you seeing as some of the the challenges and the opportunities for citizen experiences?
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Liz. I think, it's always very good to have close and rooted examples. Nothing gets much more easier than you working on a project and one of your employees not knowing how to make that happen. So in my perspective, Daniela, I think there are three main reasons why this is important. Number one, to bridge the gap, essentially the digital divide that exists between, you today have, haves and have-nots, and the digital haves and digital have-nots. Second is in anchoring citizen-centric services for the future. And then the third one is actually, this is here and now. This is not something that is distant and far out in the future. Now, on the digital divide, right, there's a lot of factors that come into play. Today, I think the socioeconomic factors, infrastructure limitations on where you are and how you approach these services is driving the disparity, is accentuating the disparity between accessing digital services and what that means, right, for creating opportunities, helping simplify things. Second thing is on citizen centricity, right, and I think this is such a critical thing, right? It's no more an aspiration. It's a necessity, right? The simple question is, why should my government services not be as simple as ordering coffee at a Starbucks, or my experience in banking, not going to a bank, right? I mean, today I have the ability to just scan a check on my phone and be done, right? I haven't visited a bank in, more than 12 months. And then the other thing here is that this digital transformation, as you pointed out, Daniela, powered by blockchains and DLTs and Web3s more broadly, along with commitment from government, is actually going to forge an equitable and accessible future for all. And this is not going to happen just because somebody, this is not going to happen. There has to be a deliberate effort by leaders. And Liz is a great example here that, somebody epitomizes the leadership that is required to turn tomorrow's vision into today's reality. And I think for all those three reasons, it's a very important aspect. And I think let's not forget about, sort of the invisible hand and all of these things, right? Which is legislation, or maybe not so invisible hand in it. But that becomes a critical part of how do you progress this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I love the thinking of the digital, the citizens' requirements and that digital divide, because I do think that's important. But regulation obviously comes into play here, right? And legislation, and some states and some countries obviously are leading further, faster, and we see a lot of that obviously coming out of Rhode Island, which is great to see. Liz, can you comment a bit around what's the relevant legal regulatory landscape that you see here in the United States, and with a focus on Rhode Island?
We did a lot of research to figure that out, because that was, of course, the first question. Because before you implement the system that we're looking to implement, can you even do it? Because if you can't do it legislatively, then you got to wait till the legislative cycle goes, which could take up to a year or two to pass laws. So after doing an enormous amount of research, we discovered that we didn't have to do anything to do the blockchain project that we're doing. However, this was at the beginning of blockchain, and we basically threw blockchain into the bucket for everything. We did have to do some things for crypto side. And so we worked on the licensure, streamlining the licensure piece of it. But from a utilization of blockchain, we didn't have to do anything. However, it's on a case-by-case basis, right? So depending on what you're specifically wanting to do, you might need to do something. Great example is a lot of states are now using blockchain technology for their driver's licenses to have those available that are can be on your phone. That does require legislation. So something specific like using your driver's license as instead of having a physical one, if you wanted to, whether it's being able to buy alcohol or cigarettes or whatever it is, you have your driver's license. But it was also for police to be able to accept it. So it really depends on the specific issue. But we also are starting to see legislation around it from a privacy aspect. So we've seen it where there's sort of the right to be able to choose. Do I want to do this? Do I have to do it electronically? Does it have to be on a blockchain, right? And so we're seeing some states really take a look at that. And then you're hearing, of course, in Europe, and now you're starting to hear in Canada and the United States about the right to be forgotten. And so those are all sort of new things that are coming out. But as far as legislation to do what you want to do, it really depends very specifically on what it is your goal is.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah. And I do, completely wholeheartedly agree around the digital identity requirements and kind of making sure that there are specific legislations and regulations that people can adhere to as well. So I do think so. And we'll talk a bit more about the specific use cases in a bit. But before we go that, Charles, maybe your perspective, AWS works with many government customers in the public sector. What kind of relevant regulations are you seeing being applied in the blockchain space specifically?
That's an excellent question. The landscape is, the regulatory and legal landscape is for blockchain in the public sector is still evolving. We have different states that have enacted legislation regarding the use of blockchain, and we've worked with some of those states as part of their request for information, just to kind of give them additional context. And for instance, like in 2019, Colorado launched a app-based digital driver's license, and also Arizona also began to offer digital ID for Apple smartphones last year. And we worked with them on that. And we've also seen impact of COVID because everybody was working from home, but they still needed to be able to get their driver's licenses and other types of verification. The impact COVID actually sped up adoption of some of these services and sped up the legislation as well. In California, the governor just signed Senate Bill SB 786, which allows county recorders upon request to issue a certified copy of the birth certificates or death certificates or marriage certificates as a verifiable credential using blockchain technology. And in addition, we also work very closely with Utah on a bill that got signed earlier this year, which was HB 740, which requires their state division of technology services to launch a pilot program that will be working on for digital verifiable credentials using blockchain technology. And also there are other bills that are helping to create a legal framework for decentralized autonomous organizations, which is their online cooperatives that live on the blockchain and are governed by ownership in tokens or cryptocurrency to operate in the states. And that new law will actually treat those DAOs that haven't registered as corporate entities or nonprofits, the legal equivalent of a domestic limited liability company. And last but not least, I think as the regulatory landscapes evolves, we're going to see governments, there need to be proactive in developing practices and policies and regulation that will enable safe and responsible use of the technology. Liz talked about privacy, right to be forgotten laws, like California has the Privacy Act, and also Europe has the GDPR, which can be in conflict with blockchain legislation. And basically, the fact is, since the blockchain is immutable, you can't delete the information. We need to ensure that certain personal identifiable information, or PHI, which is personal health information, in the case of healthcare use cases, are not stored on the blockchain. So instead, we deploy the hash of that data. Cryptographic hash of data will be stored in the blockchain along with a reference to the location where the data is stored on a mutable database. So if a user requests for the data to be deleted at some point, that can be done easily.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, things around verifiable credentials and identity, as I mentioned before, quite important. And across the Hyperledger ecosystem, we see a lot of these use cases in the public sector space, especially in collaboration with public and private sector, like what we're talking about here, right? When the public sector is working with the private sector to come up with these solutions. And in Europe, for example, we see regulations around things like sustainability with the EU Deforestation Act that just came through in the spring to ensure that food and byproducts of agriculture are sustainably farmed from a forest perspective. And also the electronic vehicle car battery requirements are on sustainability in the EU battery passport. So we're seeing a lot of work coming out of Europe for sure, also in Canada around digital identity requirements. And we're seeing even governments getting involved in blockchain and building public infrastructure. So like in Latin America and Caribbean with LACchain, where they're actually building a layer 1 blockchain. They're using Hyperledger to do that, to build public infrastructure so that governments, agencies, and private sector can build on top of LACchain, which essentially is a permissioned public blockchain. And in Europe, we're also seeing EBSI, which is the European blockchain systems, and that was part of the European Commission, and Austria and Spain. So blockchain is being used by governments building public sector applications for sure. Shri, can you talk a little bit about the solutions specifically that we are talking today with Rhode Island? Using Hyperledger technologies.
Yeah, sure. I think as Liz was mentioning, one of the key areas when we started out, and this is just not with the state of Rhode Island, but with other areas also, is that when you look at use cases, there are primarily 3 buckets in which you can put the use cases. A bucket which requires nothing to be done from a legal legislative perspective, in that it's legal to do stuff on blockchain either as an addition to what you're already doing as part of what the law requires, say for example issuing a license or a credential, which is done paper, but in addition to that you're also adding a digital thing. Second stuff is where it requires, second bucket is it requires some amount of legislative or interpretation. And the third piece is, as Liz was mentioning, stuff like driver's license, which absolutely requires a legislative support, legislative backbone before moving into this. I think from the perspective of this specific project about Rhode Island that we're here discussing, we worked with I think Liz and her team were sourcing different use cases. If I'm not mistaken, we had if not more, at least 60-odd use cases that we started out with in terms of where can blockchain be applied across the state, more focused on Department of Business Regulations, which was the agency which started out this initial project. And then I think through a more standardized framework and a methodology, working along with different stakeholders, we were able to narrow it down to a handful of use cases, which a couple of things, right? So number one is doable, and second thing is, in doing whatever it is that we're doing, it's worthwhile doing. And one such use case is the certified public accountant licenses, which is what we've done, and we've published extensively along with Liz and others from the state of Rhode Island. And it's a pretty simple thing, right? Certified public accountants. There's essentially 3 things that need to happen, right? Number one, you need to make sure that I am who I am, saying that if I'm Sri Chala and I was born and raised somewhere, and whatever is my identity, that's verified. Second thing is my educational qualifications. Do I have the right set of educational qualifications in order to qualify to practice wherever I'm practicing the profession? And the third thing is around the actual license itself that is issued by the required agency or department within the state, within the jurisdiction. And when these 3 things come together, that is when you have a verified, approved, certified public accountant license, which then allows that individual or that entity, a group of people together, to practice. And oftentimes what happens is a lot of these things are done after the fact. The services are rendered, and that's when you probably figure out that something is not correct. And I think, just drawing upon what Liz has mentioned, right? A great example for this is I had a gas leak that I sensed in my house a couple of months ago. Called a local contractor to come in, and they said, we can come in this afternoon. Now, it happens to be that the individual did not carry a license to operate in a mid-rise building in the city, in the jurisdiction that I'm living. And all of this was only possible to be done with multiple emails and phone calls and this, that, and the other, versus I think, when you codify all of this and put everything together, you would not even be able to contact or contract with that individual and be able to provide or render that service. So broadly speaking, that's sort of what we have done. Now, I'll just touch upon a few other things, which is, in addition to credentialing, I think another area, Charles touched upon this, which is the California Senate Bill 786 that has been enacted, which now offers or allows counties to record, issue, and verify vital records on the blockchain. We've built a system for this in partnership with AWS for one of the counties in California. This is now again something that's seeing a lot of traction, given the tailwinds or the force that has been put at the back of it through some legislative support that is coming in. Now, overall, from why does it matter, in terms of the choice of technology or the group of technologies that one has to pick up, right? And I think here, the capabilities of, the broad set of projects that Hyperledger has are relevant and important because two things, right? So number one is, can I drive immediate success? So which is one important thing, because you don't want experiments to last for months or years together, because by then everybody would have lost interest. But then an equally important thing is, does this framework, technology, choice of architecture give me the long-term legislative compliance for my evolving innovation goals? And I think this is where the sweet spot is for Hyperledger Besu, Fabric Indy, and a bunch of other things that will come together. We see, based on our experience, that especially for public sector, this is such a great place, because these technologies do provide a native way to support and offer these things.
Liz, do you want to add to that and talk a bit more about the solutions themselves?
For us, again, it was my goal is to make it easier to do business, right? And so that was sort of the overarching piece. And so we said, all right, well, how can we do this? And I very much have been a fan of the Estonian model. And so we where do you start if you're looking at the Estonian model?
So can you explain the Estonian model, maybe for some of the attendees who might not be familiar? That one's been out there for a long time. All those of us who've been in the industry for a long time, we know exactly what you mean. But if you could
I'll give you my 30-second interpretation. So my bad if I get it wrong. I did get to go to Estonia last fall to really get a hands-on, but the way I interpret it and what we want to do is essentially have one place of entry with one identification, right? So, I have I'm an e-resident of Estonia, and I have my card somewhere here. But, the ability to enter one website to be able to do all of your governmental functions, and so I believe in Estonia, every single governmental function except for marriages and divorce are somehow electronic. I don't think any other government can even come close to being able to say that they have that. And one of the beauties of it is that you don't have to enter your name over and over and over again, right? So you see here that I'm Elizabeth Tanner Esquire on there, but I'm also Liz Tanner. And sometimes I'm Elizabeth Mary Tanner if my mother's trying to yell at me. And sometimes I use the Esquire and sometimes I don't, right? And so, when you have a name, if it's not the same name in government, that causes us a lot of problems, right? And it also makes it more ripe for fraud. So for us, it was very much, can we have one way to get into a system and then perform government services? So I call it the hub and spoke model. What we're aiming to do is essentially you enter through one website. I'm able to prove that I'm Elizabeth M. Tanner, Esquire, and that's my official name. And then I can do the variety of governmental functions that are the spokes on the wheel. That's what we're aiming to do. And so we started with the CPA license. And why did we start with the CPAs? Because CPAs are accountants in America, and they're one of the few professions that have to continuously prove that they are licensed accountants because they file taxes in lots of other states. And that's a pretty common thing for them. So we wanted to be able to give them the opportunity to be able to say, here's a way that I'm recognized. And then other governments would be able to say, okay, that's a recognized CPA. And so it's a verified credential. They're able to do business within our state. But that was really the first piece of it, because where we're trying to grow next is the business registration process. So pretty much any state in America, if you want to become a corporation or an LLC, you need to file with what's almost always the Secretary of State's office, with the Division of Taxation, as well as if you have employees with the Department of Labor and Training. That's what we call them in my state. I'm sure they're called something similar in most other states. And so that's 3 different places that you have to go. You also have to let the IRS know, and you also let your county or your municipality know that you're working there. That's for any business, whether you're a restaurant or a big, huge corporation conglomerate that makes, manufacturers. That's pretty much how you start. So what we're trying to do is to get those places as the first spokes on the wheel, so that you only have to go to one place instead of all of those different places to set up your business. Then ultimately what we do is start to add on more and more and more spokes. So if you're a restaurant, you have to do some forms with the Department of Health. If you are restaurants on the ocean, you might have to do some forms with the Department of Environmental Management. So you just keep adding more and more spokes. That's sort of the Estonian model, and that's the model that we're trying to employ. But you have to start with something really small first, and then you have to get people to be on board with it before you can add a whole lot more. And you would have thought that doing what Sri just described as something simple, but it was extremely complicated, and it continues to be extremely complicated. So it's something that all governments struggle with, but we're making our way.
If I might add to what Liz just said, or Elizabeth Mary Tanner just said, I think the problem with the Estonia model is it works for Estonia or countries or entities, governmental entities, where there's a centralized identity. But in the case of the United States, the key issue is you have over 50 states. Each state is its own mini state or its own mini country. And there are also laws on the books that prefer sharing of information between the federal government or the federal and state. So we can't really implement that model here in the state, in the US, because there are lots of institutional and political resistance to those types of centralization. So I think that might be the issue. I mean, we can handle it at a state level, but imagine the case of the restaurant you talked about that has to register, that wants to open up branches in multiple states. They have to go through that same process in Rhode Island, but if they want to go to California, they're subject to somewhat different legislation, and they have to kind of provide the same validation and processes that they've already done in Rhode Island. And even moving when a person is moving from one state to the other, I have to give up my existing driver's license and then move to a different state and apply for a new driver's license. So that whole process, it's much harder to implement here in the United States. And but I'm hoping that as more people adopt blockchain services, there might be a federation of blockchains that allows you to, validate your identity using, technology like zero knowledge proofs. Even though if you had your birth certificates in the US, those different networks across state lines can, allow the verified credentials to pass from one jurisdiction to the other.
And Charles, isn't that the dream, right? Isn't that the dream, to be able to see that kind of connection? I don't know if it's going to happen in any of our lifetimes, but you'd like to think that maybe that's the way we'll be in 100 years. Who knows?
But a lot of the efficiencies, right? The efficiencies that you're seeing, for example, with the CPAs, right, or the businesses, I think that's really critical. And sometimes it's not, as I always say, it's not as sexy, right? The mainstream media don't want to talk about, CPAs getting to do their jobs better. That's the reality of it. But you know what? The CPAs certainly do, and the businesses doing business and the government's doing business with those CPAs certainly do as well. Sri, can I call on you to talk a little bit about the specific Hyperledger technologies that for this use case you have been working with Rhode Island on?
Yeah, sure. So on the specific use case, we built it on top of Hyperledger Indy because this is related to identity, and then we deployed it on top of AWS. There's again additional kinks in terms of stuff that we need to do, which again it's a work in progress that we're building on. And I think to Liz's point about the hub and spoke model, right? Now, that's essentially how we looked at this thing, right? There's basic Lego blocks with one application that is built on Hyperledger Indy for in this case Department of Business Regulation for CPA licensing. But then as part of that itself, we had silent participants from other departments and agencies that were just in a listen only mode with Department of Motor Vehicles and Secretary of State's office, which again the idea was that if and when they're ready to progress and add more use cases, you can build on that basic framework and structure that you have, where you either add more people, add more volume, add more licenses to that particular use case, or you expand by adding more applications on top of the core system itself that we've built. I think I like to take a little more optimistic approach. I'd hope that if not to the Estonia model, we'll get closer to that within our lifetimes. But again, I think to a large extent, the way in which this is going to be driven is primarily to pick up on technology, pick up on the ability of Hyperledger with its modularity, with its architecture for data privacy and security, which again these things are important because they're the ones that are going to decide whether a project is going to be a success or a failure. And again, we'll come to a little bit about the challenges, but broadly speaking, that's sort of the high level view of it.
Yeah, and for those of you who might not know much about the Hyperledger Foundation, our projects, there's 13 different projects. Shri kind of talked about the modularity and the ability to pick and choose and actually combine either projects within Hyperledger or even outside of Hyperledger. Hyperledger Indy is also being very well used in digital services in Canada. The government of Canada, particularly British Columbia, has been doing some great work, and Indy is being used, the sovereign network, and in Europe in a lot of use cases as well. So mature, right? It's been a mature project since 2017, alongside some of our other identity projects like Hyperledger Aries and AnonCreds, which is our newest verifiable credentials. But I talk about maturity, right? We're now close to like 8+ years, all of us here on this panel working on blockchain and blockchain solutions, I think many of us thought that we'd be further along, right? We'd be further along in implementations and not having to do a lot of the education around blockchain. And, I always say this, and sometimes people are like, oh yeah, that makes sense, is, a lot of these platforms, blockchain or DLT is just one piece, and very often just a very small piece of the whole solution. There's a lot of other enterprise systems and other technologies that it needs to be integrated with. There's a lot of data and interoperability questions and requirements and data modeling that needs to be done. And there's a lot of education and upskilling. You have to educate not only the business decision makers, but the engineers and the people that are going to run these systems and be relying on these systems. So there's a lot of upskilling at the government level. In Hyperledger as a foundation, and what we do with the Linux Foundation education programs is really helping that education and upskilling of users from a technology perspective, but more also from a why blockchain and how blockchain perspective as well. So it has been a long time. And, so there's challenges and some limitations. And, I'm going to toss this over to you, Charles, because you've seen many of these as well, in developing and implementing blockchain specifically for public sector services that we're talking about today. So what are some of the challenges that you see that you'd like to share with the audience today?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. From my perspective, it's like, first of all, is understanding the technology. It's complex. It's a complex technology. It's difficult to understand. We've already talked about some of the legislative hurdles that you have to go through. But in terms of implementation, part of the issue, and I must say this, is because there's so many different application areas. There's vital records, there's health records, there's supply chain and property, and different other types of applications. And for each of those applications, within Hyperledger Foundation, there are different preferred projects that can be used. Like Indy, which we talked about, that it was implemented in Rhode Island, is ideally suited for digital identity. Hyperledger Fabric, which is more broad, more general, and it's probably one of the oldest and most mature, as you might mention, can be used for different tasks. However, on the subject, so you can use it for supply chain, you could use it for credentials, you could use it for all sorts of things. The only area where there's a limitation is it doesn't natively support the IDs, decentralized identification. And so Aries, for instance, sits on top of Indy in most cases. So when you're deploying it, you have to deploy a blockchain of nodes for Indy, and then run Aries on top of it. And then there's a non-creds. So, and if you think about it from the perspective of a state, and they're going to be using it for transportation, for supply chain, they might start with a supply chain project, and deploy a network of Hyperledger Fabric nodes. And obviously, they might want to use a managed service like AWS, Amazon Managed Services, to kind of take away the undifferentiated heavy lifting. And then they now decide they want to work on a credential project. And now you have to now deploy a new network of Indy nodes side by side with that. So you could have, within one state, you could have a multitude of blockchain networks, and which different teams and different departments and different organizations within the state have to manage and maintain. So our position is, for customers, we want to take away the undifferentiated heavy lifting of running those nodes and provide a managed service. And again, we provide Hyperledger Fabric as a service. And instead, for most of the projects that we've seen, like for instance, the project in California, that project was built on Hyperledger Fabric. It's possible to actually run a non-creds on top of any type of blockchain services. So we think that, even if you look at the way the Aries Foundation is moving, the Aries project is moving, they're moving beyond supporting just Indy as a network, because they realize this is a challenge that you're going to face if you're even within a corporate organization or state. If you have to run different types of blockchain networks and maintain them, it's not scalable. So they provided a wrapper for Fabric, so you can actually run Aries on Fabric, so you can have one single network, preferably a managed network, which is managed by other people, and then you can run Aries or a non-creds, which also supports Hyperledger Fabric. So that's kind of the direction we see things going, but again, every approach it depends on the two approaches. Like in some states, everything is handled at the state level, and all different teams or departments leverage the shared services. In some cases, different counties, like in the case of Riverside, are handling their own projects, and some other counties are doing different things. So determining exactly which of these technologies to apply also boils down to the approach that the states and government entities decide to move forward with.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, things like managed services and services that are specific to use cases does help governments. And I just spent a week in Japan, and, talking about the same thing with the prefectures there, with the different, basically different governments around Japan, and the same issues, as well as what is the solution. Sri, maybe a little bit from you around the challenges and limitations that you see in your implementations.
Sure. I think, and you hit it on you hit it right now, in that, there's, 8+ years behind us. Why are we still not seeing large scale implementation? I can't emphasize this enough. And, especially being a company which provides technology, right? The failure of most projects, or lack of success, or lack of visibility of most projects, it's not rooted so much in technology. It's a lot to do with strategic and business thinking behind the initiative itself. This is sort of a thinking that has evolved along with Liz and our work. There's three things that are very important, right? When you think about a project, how will you fund the initial project? Because that's critical. Where you're going to get money from first. How will you sustain on an ongoing basis? It's not enough, right? I mean, you throw some dollars at it, it's great, but how are you going to sustain it on an ongoing basis if you're going to run, let's say, issuance of CPA licenses or verification of marriage records or something else. And then do not forget about the grand vision. How does it tie all the various agencies and departments and services together? And this is, again, to your point about education, what comes out as an important aspect is, number one, to have a champion that not just speaks blockchain, but is able to speak, the language of the government and different agencies. And, Rhode Island and with Liz is a great example of that. And then, being able to promote the same thing with different other agencies. I touched upon a little bit about the work that we've done in the pilot with CPA licensing. Liz was great and successful in recruiting, a couple of other senior stakeholders from, other agencies and departments to say, oh, this sounds interesting enough. We'll listen only. I think today somebody is listening. Tomorrow they'll start to do piloting, and soon you'll start to see them, deploy things at scale on their thing. The other thing, again, this is probably, emphasizing it again and again, but the right use case and the right scope for the project is very important, because if it's too small, it becomes insignificant. You won't get the support. And if it's too big, you might have taken a bite more than what you can chew. And that just makes it even more difficult to move forward. And again, right, I think, to the point of how do you overcome many of these challenges? It's about, the grand vision, which is that, if I start to have CPA licenses issued, or if I have vital records issued on blockchain, what value does it create? What is the emergent value that gets created because of that fact that you now have stuff on the blockchain, right? Do the verifiable credentials reduce KYC costs for banks? Does it make it easier for insurance companies to do underwriting? I think this is sort of very critical, right? We speak a lot, and I think today's panel is definitely about public sector. But again, the boundaries and the value of this is when you push it and see the public-private sector value and the use cases that you have, and that's truly what I'll let Liz also speak about it. That's truly what Liz is also driving, which is where do we see the value? It's great that we've done this for the state. How do I get the public sector and private sector to come and join this? Because that's where most of the value is going to be, and that's where you'll unlock the value.
Daniela, I'm happy to go next.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm getting a kick out of watching the chat on the side, right?
Yeah, I want to get to some of those questions next too.
Alfonso, they feel my pain, right? So and Jeff in the Q&A section. So I'll be quick. One of my things is I don't use the word blockchain anymore at all, because it's a dirty word. People don't like it. It scares them. It freaks them out. I'm never going to get funding for my project. So I rarely say the word blockchain anymore. And I just talk about centralized services, streamlining of processes, things like that. I'm actually being harassed pretty bad right now on Twitter by someone who's calling me the greatest threat to the state of Rhode Island because of my blockchain project, right? So keep that in mind. There's also political cycles for me. So I have new governors, I have new bosses, I have new legislators who ultimately decide whether I get funding or not. And for example, if I were to leave the state of Rhode Island, I think it's pretty safe to say that my project dies, right? So those kinds of things happen. If the people who know about blockchain and understand the project, if those legislators leave, then I have to recruit new people to be able to provide the funding, because otherwise I'm re-educating all over again about what the project is. There's the fear of being first. It's just so much easier to let some other state like California, like New York, like Texas, like the big ones do it, because there's always a fear of failure. Governments aren't allowed to fail ever because we get criticized hard for it. We're wasting taxpayer dollars. So that's always a problem. There's always the question of, are you actually solving a problem? You're just trying to find some cool new thing, right? And so I constantly have to have business leaders support the project to say, no, really, it is a problem that I have to go to all these different places, all these different times, and I don't know. And then to Jeff's question about the unions, that is absolutely a big question that we got at the beginning, but we were very quick to be able to prove that that's not a problem, because in a small state like Rhode Island, we only have a little over 1 million people. We have about 1,500 open state jobs. There are plenty of places to have other state employees go to. So we've been able to overcome the union concern very early on, but that was a major part of getting funding, was being able to address that concern. A licensed clerk is probably one of the lowest paid jobs. So we had to provide sort of assurances that if a clerk was going to lose their job, that they would actually probably now qualify for a higher paying job. So there's all of these things, but also getting credentials for CPAs is not sexy at all, right? So to Shree's point of a big project or too small of a project, that's a really tough piece to play with. It's got to be sexy enough that people get excited about it, but not too big that they're afraid of it as well. So that's my quick answer.
That's great. And thank you for addressing Jeff's question specifically around employees. And because, but this is not unique to blockchain. It's, all new technologies need to address these, right? How is it going to affect the workforce as well? So thank you for addressing that. And I think we're all, for those of you on YouTube and on LinkedIn Live that might not be in the Zoom chat, we're all kind of smiling at Alfonso Gavella's comment around the chief political operators are needed for any of these DLT projects for sure. And certainly Liz is a CPO to their best in the industry for sure as well. So, I think there's a couple other questions. There was a question specifically, and then I want to close off with what does the future hold? What does the panel see as a future hold? But there's a couple other questions that I think might be helpful. There was a question specifically from Maria Morano around how the wallets are managed, where the CPA credentials are stored currently. If one of you can address that.
Probably best for you to do it, Sri.
I think we'll take that question. I think it'll take a little longer time in terms of answering that question. Gaurav is on the chat. He's the senior architect from blockchain, so he's going to try and answer that question on the chat.
As of right now, we have an app, right? There's an app on a phone, and you can retrieve it that way.
Yeah, I think typically it's like either you're hosting it, you're custodying it on behalf of the citizen, or the citizen has the app on their phone and it's stored on their Apple Wallet, for instance. So it's similar to some of the COVID credentials that were issued on blockchain during COVID. You have it on your phone when you're going through the airport or areas where you're required to show your COVID pass. You just show. So it's very simple in that sense. You don't have to worry about using things like MetaMask, Web3 wallets. It's just going to be embedded in the app in most cases.
Great. Thank you. There was another question around did Rhode Island set up a private indie network, or are you using Sovereign? Another one that will get answered in the Q&A.
Yeah, I can take that.
Answer.
Yeah, this is Gaurav. Yeah. So this was a private indie network.
Okay. So the answer to that question, it's a private indie network and not the Sovereign network. For those of you who don't know, Sovereign is a public infrastructure network that runs on Indie as well. There was a question,
and I just want to emphasize that some of these aspects that are great technical questions, we're happy to answer those, but we want to be careful about how much we talk about the detailed implementation itself. So that's part of the reason why there's a little bit of hesitation. Again, there's a public case study about it to the extent that Liz and the team have approved from the Department of Information Technology. That much information is publicly available, but just know that that's the reason for some of these responses.
All right, fantastic. And maybe we can find the link to that case study. I know if the team could put it on the chat, that'd be fantastic. There was a question from Alicia Knoll around when drafting potential legislation regarding digital driver's license or other IDs. Are lawmakers understanding the difference between giving law enforcement access to IDs hosted on the device and giving complete access to everything on that device? And then, we talked a little bit about, right, the privacy and kind of the citizen privacy. And obviously with CPI licenses is slightly different, right? If someone wants to see that I'm a certified public accountant, I think that's easy enough for me to allow people to see. But any thoughts around other digital identity use cases and potentially how this technology actually enables these to be securely presented with essentially with the individual themselves having the authority to say, this agency can see this type of data about me, et cetera. So any comments from the three of you on that question.
Sure, I can talk on that. So we recently worked with the government of South Korea and about 4 or 5 mobile technology companies, telecom companies, to build their e-driver's license application, which is helping to improve the security and convenience of identity verification. So it's a mobile app. It's used by about 30 million South Korean residents to prove their driving qualification, adult status, or identity through a verification system. It was built on Amazon managed blockchain. And the beauty of it is, typically when you go to, say, for instance, a liquor store, you have to prove that you're above the age of 21. You typically have to take your driver's license with you, right? And show your driver's license. If you have a verified credential app and you have a virtual version or e-version of that on your phone, and you're able to redact, for instance, your address, so you only simply show just the information needed to prove that you're above the age of 21, which is your date of birth. And so being able to redact certain aspects like your name or your address improves security. And if you leave the house with your your physical wallet or driver's license in your wallet and that gets stolen, you can't, just recovering that, including your credit card, is always a problem. So having that on your phone that you can carry on your phone without having to carry a physical driver's license is a very secure and convenient for over 30 million residents. And we feel that that's more the convenience, the authenticity, and the flexibility and convenience is it kind of outweighs any other risks that might happen.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. We're going to wrap it up with kind of thinking about the future. I think all of us here and many of the participants in the webinar for sure are very bullish on blockchain technology, right? We know we've seen it in action. We know that it scales. It has a very rich and growing ecosystem of engineers who can support and build these kind of solutions. We have seen enough use cases worldwide to see the success of the use cases. We've talked about some of the challenges that some are not related to the technology at all, right? It has to do with the politics and kind of the education of societies, as any new technology, as I mentioned before, we'll see out there. We'll start with you, Liz. Where do you see more innovative solutions and processes in the future for public sectors that will utilize blockchain? And blockchain, when I say blockchain related technologies, some of the, for example, digital identity stacks like Aries that can work with blockchain and non-blockchain as well. So what should we be looking to?
I think 2 things for me. You need citizens and businesses to demand it. They're just used to this old way, but you have this whole generation that's had some sort of a phone in front of their faces their whole lives, right? And then you've got folks who only ever done paper processes. So we're in this transitional stage of going from one to another. So you're about to reach an inflection point where it's going to be what the norm is and what's required to do. So we'd like to be able to try to set that up now. So that's what that happens. But you've also got to have the education level. So when I'm sitting before legislators who are, they're elected because they believe very strongly in a couple of things, but the reality is they're a legislator for all things. And so when I bring before them this thing called blockchain technology to do advanced technological services to make it easier to do business within the state, that's a lot for them, right? So, the education piece of it is particularly critical to legislators, as well as having other governments do the projects so that it becomes an acceptable way of doing business. Those are the things that are the biggest challenges for me, that if I can overcome those 2 items, then I think you're off to the races and everybody just starts doing the projects because that's what's needed and everybody understands it. But until then, it's going to be a real challenge for me.
Yeah. I tell you, when citizens say, I'm going to choose to live in this state versus that state because they're offering me better digital services. And I think this generation will do that because they want to live in that way. I agree. That's going to be an inflection point for sure for technology. Charles, over to you. What does the future hold for public sector use cases in the industry?
Charles, I think you're on mute.
You're on mute. We almost had it the whole webinar.
Can you all hear me now? I was saying something very eloquent, but
there you go.
Now I lost it. So, I think looking to the future, I think we see different use cases. Siri talked about the Riverside County Vital Records pilot that we operate, and again, we've launched that pilot, and we're extending, going into phase 2, working with Infosys, it's going to be running on Amazon Managed Blockchain. So the product's still in the early stages, but it has that potential. But in addition, we're planning on working with other counties in California and agencies in California to create like a statewide blockchain network. So once you have that, think about the capabilities that can bring about. You can have other agencies like the DMV, Department of Healthcare Services, CalPERS, which is one of the largest, retirement companies, for teachers. They can listen for events like birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificate issuances, and they can respond by initiating action off-chain. So, for instance, if you take the case of CalPERS, if somebody dies in the family, and for instance, a death certificate is issued, CalPERS could say, for instance, listen for those events, and then initiate a communication with the family, expressing their condolences and saying this person happened to be a beneficiary, and started reaching out to beneficiaries, start processing claims. So that can help, speed up changes and also help speed up, payments of the claims. In the case of, Covered California, for instance, if they're like the Obamacare exchange in California, if they're joining a chain, this statewide blockchain, they can listen for birth events. And for instance, when a birth certificate gets issued, Covered California can initiate processes of the steps to reach out to the families, congratulating them and say, hey, we would like to add this child. Would you like to add this newborn baby to your list of beneficiaries in your health insurance? So this can help transform the way government does business. And that's what we're at AWS, we're very, very excited about. And also looking to the future, we're focused on innovations that kind of make it easy for developers to instantly interact with blockchain networks and using APIs. So instead of having to deal with managing the blockchain nodes, you could just point to an API and you don't have to worry about specialized infrastructure like those nodes. So we've also made some efforts in launching new services like AMB Access and Query, which was launched last month, which gives developers instant access to standard procedure calls to interact with digital assets, not just on the private side, but also on public networks as well. And also, we just also launched AMB Query, which provides standardized blockchain data from multiple blockchains, including Bitcoin and Ethereum. So that will help customers who are looking to pull information from the blockchain and query historical data from the blockchain without having to manage or use blockchain infrastructure.
Right. Maybe you can come back and do a member in-depth webinar on those use cases as well. Shri, closing off the session, some of your thoughts from you, and then we'll just go through some closing. Yep.
Yeah, I know we're already out of time. So I think in short summary, as we see this ecosystem transform from paper-based records to digital also records to digital only records, what we will see happen is that the service models will change drastically. The function of governments will itself change in terms of how you're doing things, and the number of use cases that are going to get added and that are going to get accepted will drastically change. And I think 5 years from now, I think with all these this generation of mobile only generation, you're probably going to see a lot of acceptance for digital only records, and that's where the holy grail is.
Excellent. Thank you, Shri. Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Charles, for today's session. For those of you who, there's a couple of questions, and feel free to connect with us on additional questions as well. I want to just highlight, today's session was fantastic, and we have many more, and you can see these Hyperledger member webinars on our events page, as well as other events that we speak at and we participate in, and we would love to see everybody here. I saw somebody that saw one of my talks at Futurist last week. Please do, if you see see us at these events, do come and say hi. I would love to meet with all of you as well, but visit our events page. We are an open community. There was a question of how can you get involved and contribute. We have our Hyperledger Discord where you can chat across different special interest groups. We actually have a public sector special interest group that you can participate in and share your stories and work with the community working on public sector use cases as well. And we welcome everyone to join us if you go to hyperledger.org, and you can get access to participation. We have meetups worldwide where you can meet other developers and business-minded folks building with Hyperledger technologies. So once again, I want to thank Sri, Charles, and Liz. It's always fantastic to see the three of you for a great session, and I look forward to coming back maybe next year and getting updates on this project.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.